Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy offers a stark and profound analysis of human existence, revealing uncomfortable but essential truths about the nature of life, desire, and suffering. His insights challenge conventional optimism by exposing the underlying forces that drive our experiences and shape our perception of happiness and fulfillment. These keynotes explore how life's inherent suffering, the blind will, and the deceptive nature of desire shape our reality, and how true peace can only be found through conscious detachment. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy is grounded in the conviction that suffering is an essential and unavoidable condition of life. Unlike more optimistic worldviews that regard suffering as a temporary misfortune or a problem to be solved, Schopenhauer views it as intrinsic to existence itself. His assertion that life is suffering stems from a deeper metaphysical insight. The nature of living beings is to desire incessantly, and desire inherently causes pain. At the root of human suffering lies the ceaseless cycle of wanting. The act of living demands that one have needs, cravings, and ambitions, whether for basic survival needs like food and shelter or higher aspirations such as status, love, or knowledge. This endless craving, which Schopenhauer calls the will, is a force that continually pushes toward something they lack. When desires are unmet, they generate dissatisfaction, frustration, and emotional turmoil. Yet even when desires are temporarily fulfilled, the satisfaction is transient. The relief from longing soon fades, and a new desire emerges, perpetuating an endless loop of craving and pain. This cyclical nature of desire leads to a profound conclusion: happiness is not a permanent state, but a fleeting interval between episodes of suffering. When we experience pleasure or joy, it is often not because we have attained true contentment, but because we are momentarily free from want. This brief respite is immediately succeeded by new desires, anxieties, or boredom. Consequently, life oscillates between two unpleasant conditions: either the pain of unfulfilled desires or the emptiness of satisfied desires, which no longer motivate or excite. Schopenhauer's insight challenges common assumptions about life's purpose. The widespread cultural and philosophical emphasis on progress, achievement, and fulfillment as paths to happiness is, in his view, a delusion. Since desire itself causes suffering, efforts to chase after more wealth, more recognition, more relationships, only deepen the human predicament. The very nature of life's drive condemns us to repeated dissatisfaction beyond the individual experience. Schopenhauer extends this condition universally to all living beings. Since all organisms are driven by the will to survive and reproduce, they are all caught in the same cycle of ceaseless striving and inherent suffering. This universal aspect of suffering places human woes within the broader context of existence, where no creature escapes the burden of unfulfilled desires. Philosophically, this outlook aligns with ancient traditions such as Buddhism, which also recognize suffering dukkha as fundamental to life. However, Schopenhauer's treatment is distinctive in its metaphysical framing of suffering as emerging directly from the will, a blind force without purpose or direction. This understanding invites a radical reevaluation of how one approaches life. instead of seeking happiness through external achievements or indulgence. Schopenhauer's insight encourages awareness and acceptance of suffering as the unavoidable backdrop of existence. It suggests that liberation lies not in accumulating more or controlling circumstances, but in changing one's relationship to desire and suffering. This foundation will later lead Schopenhauer to advocate for detachment as a means to reduce suffering. In essence, life's inherent suffering reveals the futility of conventional pursuits aimed at satisfaction and challenges us to confront the fundamental nature of our existence. Recognizing that suffering is not a flaw or accident, but the very condition of life compels a deeper philosophical reflection on how to live meaningfully amid perpetual dissatisfaction. Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will is central to his philosophical worldview and serves as a profound explanation for the nature of existence and suffering. Unlike the rational, conscious will that we often associate with human agency, Schopenhauer describes the will as a primal, unconscious, and blind force that underlies all life. It is not guided by reason, purpose, or morality, but operates purely through an insatiable drive toward endless wanting and striving. The will, in Schopenhauer's metaphysics, is the foundational reality beneath the surface of phenomena. While we experience the world as objects, events, and individual agents acting with intention, what truly moves everything is this underlying force. It is the will that drives every living being, not only humans but animals and plants alike. This universal drive is not directed towards peace, fulfillment, or happiness. Rather, it is characterized by continuous, restless motion. The blindness of the will is essential to understanding why it perpetuates suffering. Because it is unconscious and without self-awareness, the will does not aim at any final goal or meaningful fulfillment. It simply pushes life forward through a relentless cycle of desire and need. When one desire is temporarily satisfied, the will immediately manifests a new desire, creating an endless loop of striving. There is no ultimate peace or satisfaction to be found within this process, because the will itself lacks any notion of completeness or rest. This concept challenges common notions of human free will and rational choice. While we believe ourselves to be autonomous agents making reasoned decisions, Schopenhauer posits that our deepest motivations stem from this irrational and blind will. Our conscious thoughts and rationalizations serve only as surface phenomena, while the will beneath controls our impulses, drives, and desires. Even our highest ambitions and ideals are expressions of this fundamental force. The implications of this are both metaphysical and ethical. Metaphysically, it means that life is governed by an irrational energy that neither cares for individual happiness nor for any moral good. It is indifferent, blind, and unrelenting. Ethically, it calls into question the pursuit of goals based on desire or craving, as these are manifestations of a force that cannot be satisfied and ultimately leads to suffering. Moreover, Schopenhauer's notion of the will reveals a profound pessimism about the human condition. Unlike philosophies that see desire as a pathway to growth or self-actualization, Schopenhauer understands desire as the root of torment. The will is not a benevolent or creative force aimed at progress, but a blind and insatiable power that condemns living beings to perpetual unrest. This relentless striving means that existence is not a journey toward a meaningful destination, but an endless treadmill of wanting, acquiring, and losing. The will's nature is to perpetuate itself through new forms of desire, making peace impossible as long as one remains identified with it. It is a force that continuously drives life forward without respite or ultimate fulfillment. This framework also helps explain why pleasure and happiness are so elusive and ephemeral. Since the will demands constant movement and new desires, moments of satisfaction are brief and always followed by fresh cravings. The will does not allow for lasting contentment because it is fundamentally a process of endless motion. Schopenhauer's concept of the will has resonances with various philosophical and spiritual traditions that emphasize the irrational or unconscious drives behind human behavior. It echoes Freudian notions of the unconscious instincts and can be related to existentialist themes of absurdity and alienation. However, Schopenhauer's unique contribution lies in his metaphysical identification of this force as the essence of reality itself. Recognizing the will as blind and insatiable also sets the stage for the possibility of liberation. Since suffering arises from identification with the will and its desires, detachment and awareness can provide a path to escape its torment. By observing the will without surrendering to its demands, one can begin to resist its compulsions and find a measure of peace. All in all, the will is not a conscious, purposeful entity, but a blind, insatiable force that propels all life into ceaseless craving and suffering. It is the invisible engine behind all desire, a force without aim or rest, shaping the human condition in fundamental ways beyond our ordinary awareness. In Arthur Schopenhauer's bleak yet penetrating vision of existence, the nature of pleasure and happiness is fundamentally misunderstood by common perspectives. Rather than seeing pleasure as a positive state in its own right, Schopenhauer argues that we typically call pleasure is merely the temporary absence or cessation of pain and suffering. This insight radically redefines the human experience of happiness and reveals the fragile and fleeting nature of what we pursue as joy. According to Schopenhauer, life swings like a pendulum between two unsatisfactory states, pain and boredom, suffering and emptiness. Because the will, the blind, incessant force driving all desires, is never satisfied, the moments when we feel pleasure or happiness are, in reality, brief pauses in the ongoing drama of suffering. Pleasure is not a full and active presence. Rather, it is a relief, a negative condition defined by the removal or absence of pain. This means that true, lasting joy is essentially unattainable within the structure of life itself. The experience of pleasure is therefore relative and dependent on prior pain or want. When a desire is frustrated or unfulfilled, it creates a painful tension within us. When that desire is finally satisfied, the tension ceases, and we experience a sense of relief. This relief is what we call pleasure. But because the underlying will immediately generates new desires, the cessation of pain is only momentary. Once the satisfaction fades, boredom or emptiness takes its place, which again prompts new cravings. This cyclical pattern leaves human beings trapped in an unending oscillation between negative states, with no permanent refuge. This understanding challenges the traditional assumption that the pursuit of pleasure or happiness is the natural goal of life. Instead, Schopenhauer's philosophy reveals that the pursuit itself is an endless chase after a constantly moving target that is defined by the absence of suffering rather than the presence of lasting bliss. The will's nature ensures that no permanent pleasure or satisfaction can be achieved, and all that exists is fleeting moments where pain is suspended. Moreover, this view of pleasure sheds light on why even moments of joy can feel unsatisfactory or hollow. When pleasure is understood merely as the negation of pain, it implies that pleasure is reactive, contingent, and insufficient in itself. It is not an affirmative state of flourishing, but a fragile and transient pause that does not provide a deep or enduring sense of well-being. Schopenhauer's idea can also be linked to the phenomenon of hedonic adaptation in psychology, where individuals quickly return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of positive or negative life events. This suggests that the human mind naturally reverts to a neutral state, reinforcing the notion that pleasure is temporary and never fully satisfying. On a broader level, the insight that pleasure is the absence of pain calls into question many societal values and cultural narratives that glorify material success, sensory indulgence, and the accumulation of possessions as routes to happiness. These pursuits offer temporary relief, but cannot overcome the fundamental dissatisfaction rooted in the will's insatiable nature. This keynote invites a more sober and realistic appraisal of human existence. Instead of chasing after elusive and fleeting pleasures, it encourages an awareness of the inherent instability of all positive experiences based on desire. Recognizing the transitory nature of pleasure allows for a deeper understanding of the human condition and sets the foundation for seeking peace beyond the cycles of craving and relief. This perspective also resonates with various spiritual and philosophical traditions that emphasize detachment and the reduction of desire as means to reduce suffering. If pleasure is just the absence of pain, then perhaps the true goal is not to seek pleasure but to minimize pain and the disturbances of the will altogether. In a nutshell, Schopenhauer's analysis of pleasure radically reframes what happiness means. It is not a positive achievement or a steady state, but a fragile and momentary absence of pain, situated between one desire and the next. This insight demands a revaluation of how we live and what we consider valuable, highlighting the futility of endless craving and pointing toward a more mindful relationship with the inherent instability of life's pleasures. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy unveils a profound and unsettling truth about the nature of human desiring what often appears to be genuine growth. Progress or love is frequently nothing more than the will manifesting itself in new disguises. Desire, in its relentless pursuit, masquerades as noble aspirations, personal development, or deep emotional connections. Yet beneath these facades lies the same blind force, seeking escape from inner dissatisfaction, rather than authentic transformation or fulfillment. To understand this keynote, it is essential to grasp that for Schopenhauer, Desire is not simply a passing feeling or whim. It is the fundamental impulse of the will, the underlying metaphysical force that drives all beings. The will is inherently restless and insatiable, always striving but never satisfied. Its attempts to find contentment are chimerical, and it continuously takes on new forms in attempt to soothe its own inner torment. These new forms may appear as ambitious goals, romantic love, or spiritual progress, but they are essentially different expressions of the same blind craving, what we often call growth or progress. Whether in personal character, career achievements, or intellectual accomplishments, is frequently a means to an end, a strategy to overcome a sense of lack or pain within. Individuals convince themselves that by achieving certain milestones or improving aspects of their lives, they will finally attain happiness or peace. However, Schopenhauer reveals that these efforts are often motivated by a desire to escape discomfort rather than genuine self-realization. The will, in its infinite cunning, presents these desires as meaningful pursuits, but their true purpose is to temporarily divert attention from the fundamental suffering inherent in existence. Similarly, love, one of the most celebrated and exalted human experiences, is not immune from this disguise. While commonly idealized as a selfless and transcendent connection between individuals, Schopenhauer views love as a manifestation of the will's reproductive drive, a biological and metaphysical impulse aimed at perpetuating the species. The emotions and passions of love, with their intense attraction and attachment, serve the will's purpose of continuing its own existence through procreation. Thus, what is perceived as romantic or spiritual love often functions as a sophisticated expression of the will's endless craving. This does not diminish the intensity or importance of love in human life, but rather reframes it as part of a larger metaphysical pattern. The will uses love as a means to fulfill its own aims, masking the underlying desire that remains insatiable. The emotional highs and lows of love, the joy of union, and the pain of separation, are reflections of the will's restless movement, rather than stable or final states of being. The idea that desire disguises itself also challenges modern ideals of self-improvement and enlightenment. Many cultural narratives encourage individuals to pursue growth, knowledge, or spiritual awakening as pathways to happiness. Yet, Schopenhauer cautions that these pursuits can become traps when they are motivated by the will's craving rather than genuine insight or detachment. In other words, personal development becomes another form of desire-driven activity unless it consciously transcends the will. This keynote prompts deep introspection about the authenticity of our motives and goals. Are we genuinely growing because of an inner transformation? Or are we merely chasing new desires to fill an emptiness? Are our relationships founded on unconditional connection? Or are they driven by the will's compulsive need for attachment and continuation? Schopenhauer's philosophy urges us to see beyond surface appearances and question the true nature of our aspirations. Understanding that desire often disguises itself as growth or love also helps explain the persistence of dissatisfaction despite apparent success or happiness. Because these desires are not ultimate solutions, but forms of escapism, their fulfillment only leads to new cravings. This cycle perpetuates suffering and keeps individuals bound to the will's endless striving. From a practical perspective, recognizing the illusory nature of such desires opens the door to greater awareness and detachment. By observing the motivations behind our ambitions and relationships, we can begin to distinguish between genuine growth and mere desire-driven activity. This discernment is a crucial step toward reducing suffering and finding a more stable and peaceful state of being. Schopenhauer reveals that much of what we consider progress, development, or love is often the will cloaked in new forms. Desire uses these noble appearances as masks to continue its restless motion, distracting us from the fundamental dissatisfaction it seeks to escape. Only through conscious awareness and detachment can one begin to see through these disguises and approach a deeper understanding of the human condition. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy points toward a profound resolution to the pervasive suffering rooted in the insatiable wills. True peace is not found in acquisition, fulfillment, or active striving, but rather in the practice of detachment. This principle stands as a counterpoint to the relentless craving that defines much of human existence. Schopenhauer teaches that liberation from torment and endless desire emerges through the conscious act of observing, resisting, and ultimately releasing attachments to worldly wants and compulsions. The will, as Schopenhauer describes, is a blind, incessant force driving beings toward perpetual wanting. Its nature is such that no achievement or possession can provide lasting satisfaction, as new desires inevitably replace old ones, creating a cycle of suffering. To break free from this cycle, one must transcend the will's dominion by adopting a stance of detachment, a deliberate withdrawal from identification with desires and their objects. Detachment, in this context, is not indifference or apathy. Instead, it is a heightened awareness combined with the ability to resist the will's impulses. It involves recognizing the transient and illusory nature of desires, acknowledging their power to cause suffering, and choosing not to be governed by them. This mindful disengagement creates a space where the restless craving subsides, allowing a state of inner calm and equanimity to emerge. Schopenhauer's concept of detachment aligns closely with many spiritual and philosophical traditions that emphasize renunciation and the diminution of desire as paths to enlightenment and peace. Whether in Buddhism's teachings on non-attachment, Stoicism's cultivation of inner tranquility, or Christian asceticism, the principle is consistent. Peace arises when the self ceases to cling compulsively to external conditions. Practically, this detachment can manifest in various ways. It may be the renunciation of material possessions, a tempering of ambitions, or the cultivation of dispassionate observation toward life's events. By distancing oneself from the constant pull of craving and aversion, one cultivates resilience to both pleasure and pain, recognizing their impermanence. Moreover, detachment does not negate engagement with life, but transforms it. Rather than acting out of compulsive desire, actions can be performed with clarity, freedom, and compassion. The detached individual is less swayed by personal suffering or egoistic longing and more capable of responding to situations with wisdom and serenity. This state is often described as a form of quiet freedom, where the individual is no longer a prisoner of the will's ceaseless demands. The peace attained is profound because it is not contingent on external conditions or temporary states of pleasure, but arises from within as a stable foundation. Importantly, Schopenhauer's notion of detachment requires effort and discipline. It involves continuous vigilance against the tendencies of the will to reassert itself. The journey toward detachment is arduous precisely because the will's power is deeply ingrained and unconscious. Yet, the reward is a liberation that surpasses the fleeting relief found in desire's satisfaction. Through detachment, one can access a state beyond the cyclical swings of agony and boredom that characterize ordinary existence. It opens the possibility of transcending suffering, not by changing external circumstances, but by transforming one's relationship to desire itself. In this way, Schopenhauer offers a pathway to peace that is radically inward-looking, centered on self-awareness and the conscious management of inner life. It challenges the prevailing assumptions of modern society that equate happiness with accumulation and achievement, proposing instead that the cessation of craving is the true source of serenity. By emphasizing detachment, Schopenhauer provides a philosophical foundation for practices aimed at mental clarity and emotional balance. His insight encourages individuals to cultivate an attitude of acceptance and release, diminishing the hold of the will and moving toward a life marked by tranquility rather than turmoil. While Arthur Schopenhauer is renowned for his dark and deeply pessimistic worldview, his reflections are not entirely devoid of moral direction. Amid the despair he identifies in human life, he locates one singular force that transcends the self, serving illusions of the will: compassion. For Schopenhauer, compassion Mitleid stands as the sole authentic foundation of morality. In a world dominated by blind striving and personal suffering, the capacity to feel the pain of another and to act in response to it emerges as a profound ethical achievement and the only real form of virtue. This compassion is not driven by religious doctrine, societal expectation, or rational calculation. It arises spontaneously when one perceives another being's suffering and recognizes in it the same essence that drives one's own existence. The same will to live, to struggle, to suffer. Schopenhauer posits that in this rare moment of moral clarity, the boundary between self and other is blurred. The individual, momentarily freed from egoistic desire, is moved not by benefit or consequence, but by genuine empathy. This view sharply contrasts with traditional moral systems, particularly those based on duty, such as Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, or theological imperatives. Schopenhauer critiques these systems as ultimately rooted in abstraction or self-interest. In his estimation, reason cannot generate moral concern. It can only articulate or distort impulses that arise more primitively and authentically within the human emotional core. The only genuine morality is one that springs directly from compassion, a deep, intuitive sense that another's suffering matters in itself. What makes this so significant within Schopenhauer's framework is the context in which compassion operates. Since life is suffering, and the will is insatiable, any action that alleviates pain, even temporarily, takes on an extraordinary moral value. In a world fundamentally structured around agony and desire, kindness becomes a quiet rebellion. To act compassionately is not to deny suffering's existence, but to acknowledge it as the shared ground of all life, and to momentarily counteract its effects. Moreover, compassion is not merely a moral ideal. It has practical consequences in human relationships and society. A compassionate person is less likely to exploit others, more inclined to forgive, and more sensitive to the dignity and fragility of life. This orientation fosters humility and restraint, recognizing that every living being is caught in the same tragic mechanism of the will. In this sense, compassion becomes the closest thing to justice in Schopenhauer's world, not a retribution-based system of fairness, but a felt acknowledgement of universal vulnerability. Importantly, Schopenhauer extends this compassion beyond the human sphere. He was one of the early philosophers in Western thought to argue for the ethical consideration of animals based on their capacity to suffer. Because the will animates all sentient life, and because suffering is not exclusive to human consciousness, moral concern should not stop at the species boundary. This stance makes Schopenhauer's ethics unusually inclusive and forward-thinking, advocating a world where all beings deserving of mercy and care are treated accordingly. Compassion, then, serves not only as the exception to Schopenhauer's otherwise grim vision, but also as its moral apex. It is the one force capable of momentarily interrupting the tyranny of the will. In the absence of salvation, transcendence, or ultimate meaning, to suffer with others and to act kindly toward them becomes the only authentically noble endeavor. Compassion does not abolish suffering, but it softens its edges, offering a glimpse of what human existence might look like if freed, even partially, from the dominion of self-centered striving. In the bleak landscape of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, where life is defined by suffering, and desire is an endless, unfulfilling cycle, propelled by a blind and insatiable will, there remains one fleeting yet profound reprieve: art. Schopenhauer regarded art not as mere entertainment or aesthetic pleasure, but as a rare and powerful means of liberation from the tyranny of the will. It is through aesthetic contemplation, when one becomes wholly absorbed in beauty, form, or expression, that an individual may temporarily escape the demands of the self and the torment of desire. The will, as Schopenhauer defines it, is the underlying metaphysical force driving all living beings. It manifests as striving, craving, and incessant motion. In everyday life, humans are almost always caught in its grip, seeking food, love, power, meaning, or comfort. But in moments of true aesthetic experience, consciousness shifts from willing to knowing. The subject no longer sees the world in terms of usefulness or personal relation, but simply beholds the object of perception in its pure form. This mode of perception suspends the ego, interrupts the usual flow of cravings, and silences the inner noise of desire. In such a state, the individual is no longer a desiring entity, but a pure will, less subject of knowledge. The suffering born of wanting is briefly replaced by a serene clarity, a timeless stillness. This is not happiness in the conventional sense. It is not the fulfillment of a wish, but rather a kind of transcendental peace that stands in stark contrast to the torment of the will. Schopenhauer emphasizes that this suspension is only ever momentary. But even these brief interludes are of immense philosophical and existential significance. Among the various forms of art, Schopenhauer gives special prominence to music, which he believed was the most metaphysically profound of all. Unlike painting or sculpture, which represent the forms of the world and thus objects of the willed, music, he argued, is a direct manifestation of the will itself. It does not describe or represent. It expresses the internal essence of reality. As such, music bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to the soul. In it, one can sense the rhythm of existence, the rise and fall of human longing, and perhaps most importantly, feel a deep recognition of shared existential struggle without the need for words. Other art forms, such as poetry, literature, sculpture, and visual arts, also serve this function by presenting representations of life purified of their immediate use or desire. A tragic play, for instance, may bring the audience into an empathetic engagement with human suffering, not to incite more craving, but to elevate understanding. To witness the universal condition without personal attachment. This encounter with the sublime, the beautiful, or the tragic allows one to step outside the self for a moment and engage with life in a mode of pure perception. Importantly, this escape through art is not an illusion or a denial of suffering, but a conscious distancing from it. Schopenhauer does not advocate hedonism or escapism through fantasy. Rather, aesthetic contemplation demands attentiveness and depth. It is not about fleeing reality, but seeing it without the filters of utility and self-interest. In doing so, the individual partakes in a higher form of awareness that, while fleeting, offers the only true relief from the prison of the will. Art, then, becomes a sacred experience within Schopenhauer's grim metaphysical framework. It is not a solution to suffering, but it is a witness to truth that offers a noble and temporary freedom. Through art, we do not conquer the will, but we momentarily transcend it, not through denial, but through understanding and suspension. In that stillness, we glimpse the world not as it is for us, but as it is in itself. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy presents a strikingly unflinching view of existence, one that strips away illusion and confronts the human condition in its rawest form. Across all 7 keynotes, a unified thread emerges that life, at its core, is an expression of a relentless and blind metaphysical force. What Schopenhauer calls the will. This will drives all beings to ceaseless striving, endlessly generating desires that can never be fully satisfied. It is not rational, not purposeful in any redeeming way, and not concerned with individual fulfillment. It simply is the engine behind all life, yet also the origin of all suffering. In this framework, suffering is not an exception to life, but its essence. We suffer because we desire, and desire is embedded in the very act of being alive. Even when we achieve temporary satisfaction, it is merely a brief respite before another craving arises. What we call pleasure is often nothing more than a fleeting pause in a deeper current of discontent. As such, human experience swings between pain and boredom, leaving little room for enduring joy. Desire further deceives us by assuming noble guises: love, ambition, growth, progress. Yet these are often masks of the same will, reshaped in more sophisticated forms. What appears to be advancement or passion may simply be a more intricate expression of the same fundamental striving, driven not by freedom but by compulsion. We imagine we are evolving, but we are frequently just shifting the direction of our craving, hoping that the next goal will offer fulfillment. It rarely does, yet Schopenhauer does not abandon hope entirely. While there is no final deliverance within the realm of the will, there are glimpses of release. The highest form of peace lies in detachment, a disciplined withdrawal from the demands of the will. By quieting desire, by observing it without yielding to it, the individual may experience a rare inner stillness. This path of asceticism, though difficult, offers an ethical and philosophical road toward transcendence, allowing one to move from a state of willing to one of contemplation. Furthermore, Schopenhauer elevates aesthetic experience as a profound yet temporary escape. In moments of deep artistic or musical contemplation, the individual ceases to be a desiring subject and becomes a pure, will-less observer of form, beauty, and truth. Here, art is not a distraction, but a metaphysical window into a world momentarily untainted by longing. It is within such moments of disinterested perception, of sublime distance from the self, that the will is momentarily suspended, and the soul is freed, if only for a time. Together, these keynotes do not offer a traditional path to happiness or salvation. Rather, they invite us to confront the existential nature of our being with honesty and depth. Schopenhauer's vision is dark, but it is not nihilistic. Within his pessimism lies a kind of philosophical courage, a refusal to sugarcoat reality, and an insistence on truth over comfort. His worldview compels us to look beyond the surface of things, to question the motivations that drive us, and to consider that perhaps liberation does not lie in attaining more, but in desiring less. It is through this radical inward turn, this willingness to confront suffering, to observe desire, and to momentarily silence the will, that the human spirit can rise above its chains and glimpse a quieter, nobler form of existence.